October 2nd, 1918. Ravine d'Argonne, France. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a shroud as Major Charles Whittlesey checked his pocket watch one final time before the advance. The hands read 0630 hours. Around him, 550 American soldiers from the 77th Division prepared for what they believed would be another coordinated push through the Argonne Forest. The sound of artillery thundered in the distance, a constant reminder that the Great War's final act was unfolding. Whittlesey folded a letter from his sister back home in Massachusetts and tucked it carefully into his breast pocket. He had no way of knowing that within hours, he and his men would become the most famous isolated unit in American military history, fighting alone in a pocket of hell that would test every fiber of their being. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive represented the largest and most ambitious American military operation of World War I. Launched on September 26, 1918, this massive campaign aimed to break through the formidable German defensive positions that had held firm for 4 years of brutal trench warfare. The offensive stretched across a 24-mile front, involving over 1 million American troops under the command of General John J. Pershing. The strategic objective was clear: punch through the German lines, capture the vital railway junction at Sedan, and force Germany to sue for peace. The Argonne Forest itself presented a nightmarish battlefield, dense with undergrowth, ravines, and carefully constructed German defensive positions that had been fortified since 1914. Machine gun nests were positioned with overlapping fields of fire. Barbed wire entanglements stretched for miles, and concrete bunkers provided shelter for German defenders who knew every tree and trail in their sector. Major Charles Whittlesey embodied the citizen-soldier ideal that characterized America's entry into the Great War. A Harvard Law School graduate and successful Wall Street attorney, the 35-year-old Whittlesey had enlisted as a private in 1917 before receiving his commission as an officer. Standing 6 feet tall with penetrating blue eyes and a methodical demeanor, he commanded respect through competence rather than charisma. His men knew him as a thorough, careful leader who studied maps late into the night and never asked them to go anywhere he wouldn't lead them himself. Captain George McMurtry, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 308th Infantry, served as Whittlesey's most trusted subordinate. A former steel company executive from Pittsburgh, McMurtry possessed the practical leadership skills that complemented Whittlesey's analytical approach. Captain Nelson Holderman of Company K brought combat experience from the Mexican border campaign, his weathered face and steady hands marking him as a soldier's soldier who had already proven himself under fire. The force that would become known as the Lost Battalion actually comprised 9 companies from 4 different battalions, a testament to the fluid nature of World War I combat operations. Companies A, B, and C of the 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment, formed the core of the advance, supported by Companies E, G, and H of the 2nd Battalion. Company K of the 307th Infantry Regiment provided additional rifle strength, while Companies C and D of the 306th Machine Gun Battalion brought the automatic weapons that would prove crucial in the coming siege. These men represented the diversity of American society. Irish immigrants from Boston, Italian Americans from New York's Lower East Side, farmers from the Midwest, and college graduates who had left comfortable lives to serve their country. Many had been in France for less than 6 months, their training hastily completed before being thrust into the crucible of the Western Front. As dawn broke on October 2nd, Whittlesey received his orders to advance up the Ravine d'Argonne toward the Charlevoix Mill and the Benarville-La Viergette Road. The plan called for a coordinated attack with supporting units advancing on both flanks, maintaining contact and mutual support as they pushed through the German defensive lines. Intelligence reports suggested that German resistance was weakening, that the enemy was preparing to withdraw to more defensible positions further north. The artillery barrage that preceded the attack seemed to confirm this assessment, as American shells pounded German positions with unprecedented intensity. Whittlesey studied his map one final time, noting the terrain features that would guide his advance. The steep-sided ravine that offered concealment but limited maneuverability, the dense forest that provided cover but restricted visibility, and the network of German trenches that intelligence had identified through aerial reconnaissance. The advance began with textbook precision. Whittlesey's men moved forward in extended formation, using the natural cover of the forest to mask their approach. The sound of rifle fire echoed through the trees as advance scouts encountered German outposts, but resistance seemed lighter than expected. By mid-morning, the battalion had penetrated deeper into German-held territory than any American unit in the sector. The men's spirits rose as they captured abandoned German positions, finding evidence of hasty withdrawal, discarded equipment, half-eaten meals, and defensive positions that showed signs of recent evacuation. Whittlesey maintained radio contact with division headquarters, reporting steady progress and requesting confirmation that supporting units were maintaining pace on his flanks. The first indication that something had gone wrong came when runners sent to contact units on the left and right flanks failed to return. Whittlesey dispatched additional messengers, but they too disappeared into the forest without a trace. By afternoon, the major realized that his battalion had advanced far beyond the positions of supporting units, creating a dangerous salient that extended deep into German-controlled territory. The units that were supposed to be advancing on his flanks had encountered fierce resistance and been forced to fall back to their starting positions, leaving Whittlesey's force completely isolated. German commanders, recognizing the opportunity, quickly moved to exploit this tactical error by positioning troops to cut off the American retreat route. As darkness fell on October 2nd, Whittlesey ordered his men to establish defensive positions on the northern slope of the Ravin de Charlevoix, a natural depression that offered some protection from enemy fire, while providing fields of fire to the front. The position, which would become known as the Pocket, measured roughly 300 yards long and 60 yards wide, barely large enough to accommodate 550 men in fighting positions. The soldiers worked through the night, using their entrenching tools to scrape shallow foxholes in the rocky soil and arranging fallen logs to provide additional cover. Machine gun teams positioned their weapons to cover the most likely avenues of German approach, while riflemen prepared ammunition and checked their weapons in the pale moonlight. Dawn on October 3rd brought the harsh reality of their situation into sharp focus. German forces had completely surrounded the American position during the night, establishing machine gun nests and sniper positions that commanded every approach to the pocket. The first German attack came at sunrise, a probing assault designed to test American defenses and identify weak points. The sound of Mauser rifles cracked through the forest as German infantry advanced through the undergrowth, their field-gray uniforms blending with the shadows between the trees. American soldiers responded with disciplined rifle fire, the sharp crack of Springfield rifles answering the German assault. The attack was repulsed, but it became clear that this was only the beginning of what would be a prolonged siege. The isolation of Whittlesey's force created immediate logistical challenges that would only worsen with each passing hour. The men had carried 3 days' worth of rations when they began the advance, but combat operations and the stress of constant vigilance increased their caloric needs far beyond normal requirements. By noon, on October 3rd, the last of the emergency rations had been consumed, leaving the soldiers to subsist on whatever they could forage from the forest floor. Water presented an even more critical problem, as the only source was a small stream that ran through a depression exposed to German machine gun fire. Soldiers who attempted to fill canteens had to crawl on their bellies through the undergrowth, often under direct enemy observation, making each trip to the water source a potentially fatal mission. The German forces surrounding the pocket employed a methodical approach to wearing down American resistance. Rather than launching costly frontal assaults against prepared positions, they relied on constant harassment through sniper fire, machine gun bursts, and the systematic use of trench mortars that could drop explosive shells directly into the American defensive positions. The psychological effect of this constant bombardment proved as devastating as the physical casualties it inflicted. Men who had never experienced prolonged combat found themselves jumping at every sound, their nerves frayed by the knowledge that death could come at any moment from any direction. The dense forest canopy that provided concealment also created a claustrophobic environment where the crack of a sniper's rifle or the whistle of an incoming mortar round seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Captain McMurtry moved constantly among his men, offering encouragement and ensuring that defensive positions remained properly manned despite mounting casualties. His calm demeanor under fire provided a stabilizing influence on soldiers who were experiencing combat for the first time. He organized the defense into overlapping sectors, ensuring that each position could provide supporting fire for adjacent positions, while maintaining all-around security against German infiltration attempts. The machine gun teams proved particularly valuable, their automatic weapons providing the firepower necessary to break up German assault formations before they could close with American positions. On the morning of October 4th, the situation deteriorated dramatically when American artillery began falling directly on the pocket. The shells, fired by American gunners who had received incorrect coordinates, exploded among the defensive positions with devastating effect. The irony was not lost on the soldiers who found themselves under attack by their own forces while simultaneously fighting off German assaults. The artillery barrage continued for over an hour, forcing American soldiers to take cover in the same shell holes and improvised bunkers they had constructed to protect themselves from German fire. Several men were killed or wounded by American shells, adding to the mounting casualty list and further demoralizing troops who were already pushed to their physical and emotional limits. Major Whittlesey realized that immediate action was necessary to stop the friendly fire incident that threatened to accomplish what German attacks had failed to achieve. His last remaining carrier pigeon, a bird named Cher Ami, represented the only reliable means of communication with division headquarters 25 miles away. With hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and stress, Whittlesey wrote a desperate message on a small piece of paper. "We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He attached the message to Cher Ami's leg and released the bird into the forest canopy, watching as it struggled to gain altitude while German soldiers fired at it with rifles and machine guns. Cher Ami was struck by German fire and fell to the ground, apparently dead. But the remarkable bird managed to take flight again, despite suffering a wounded leg and damaged wing, and flew the 25 miles to division headquarters in just 25 minutes. The message arrived shortly after the artillery barrage had already ceased, but it confirmed to headquarters that Whittlesey's force was still alive and fighting. The pigeon's heroic flight would later earn Cher Ami the Croix de Guerre with palms, but more immediately, it provided proof that the Lost Battalion had not been destroyed and was still holding its position against overwhelming odds. The German commanders surrounding the pocket recognized that their conventional tactics were failing to dislodge the stubborn American defenders. On October 7th, they attempted a different approach by sending a written surrender demand under a flag of truce. The message was delivered by an American prisoner of war who had been captured during the initial encirclement, his appearance shocking the defenders who saw the physical toll that captivity had already taken on their comrade. The German ultimatum acknowledged the suffering of the wounded American soldiers and appealed to humanitarian sentiments, suggesting that further resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties among men who had already proven their courage. Major Whittlesey read the surrender demand carefully, his face betraying no emotion as he considered the German proposal. Around him, exhausted soldiers watched their commander's reaction, knowing that their fate hung in the balance of his decision. The men had been without food for 4 days. Water was available only at great risk, and casualties mounted with each German attack. Medical supplies had been exhausted, leaving wounded soldiers to endure their injuries without proper treatment. Despite these desperate circumstances, Whittlesey's response was immediate and unequivocal. According to witnesses, he looked up from the German message and stated simply, "You go to hell." Though Whittlesey later denied using those exact words, his actions spoke louder than any verbal response. To emphasize his refusal to surrender and his determination to hold the position, Whittlesey ordered his men to remove the white cloth panels that had been placed to signal Allied aircraft. These panels, originally intended to mark American positions for friendly forces, could be misinterpreted as surrender signals by German observers. The act of removing them sent a clear message to both his own men and the surrounding German forces. The Lost Battalion would continue fighting regardless of the odds against them. This demonstration of resolve galvanized the American defenders, transforming what might have been a moment of despair into renewed determination to resist. The psychological impact of Whittlesey's refusal to surrender rippled through the ranks of his command. Soldiers who had been questioning whether continued resistance was worth the cost found new strength in their commander's unwavering determination. The message was clear. They would fight to the end, not because they had no choice, but because they chose to honor their duty and their commitment to each other. This spirit of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds became the defining characteristic of the Lost Battalion's stand, transforming a tactical disaster into a symbol of American military determination. German attacks intensified following the rejection of their surrender demand, as enemy commanders sought to break American resistance through sheer force. Flamethrowers appeared for the first time, their terrifying jets of fire adding a new dimension of horror to the siege. The psychological effect of these weapons proved as devastating as their physical impact, as soldiers who had never encountered such devices struggled to maintain their positions while facing what seemed like weapons from hell itself. The dense forest provided some protection against the flamethrowers, as the thick canopy and undergrowth limited their effective range. But the mere presence of these weapons added to the mounting stress on American defenders. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky emerged as an unlikely hero during the siege, volunteering for the most dangerous missions despite his small stature and recent arrival in France. The young soldier from New York's Lower East Side possessed an uncanny ability to move through the forest without detection, skills that proved invaluable for gathering intelligence on German positions and maintaining contact between isolated American positions within the pocket. His courage under fire and willingness to risk his life for his comrades exemplified the spirit that sustained the Lost Battalion through its darkest hours. The medical situation within the pocket deteriorated rapidly as casualties mounted and supplies dwindled. Captain Holderman, despite being wounded himself, organized the care of injured soldiers using improvised medical supplies and techniques learned through necessity rather than training. Bandages were fashioned from torn clothing, and morphine was reserved for the most severely wounded soldiers. The lack of proper medical facilities meant that men with serious injuries faced the prospect of death or permanent disability, adding another layer of suffering to an already desperate situation. Communication with the outside world remained sporadic and unreliable throughout the siege. Runners who attempted to carry messages through German lines were either killed or captured, their fate unknown to the men they left behind. The isolation was complete, leaving Whittlesey and his officers to make critical decisions without guidance from higher headquarters or knowledge of the broader tactical situation. This isolation forced the American commanders to rely entirely on their own judgment and the courage of their men, creating a level of responsibility that weighed heavily on leaders who were already pushed to their physical and emotional limits. The forest itself became both ally and enemy during the siege. The dense canopy provided concealment from German observation and limited the effectiveness of enemy artillery, but it also restricted American movement and made coordination between defensive positions extremely difficult. The undergrowth that offered cover from enemy fire also concealed German infiltration attempts, forcing American sentries to maintain constant vigilance against attacks that could come from any direction. The natural amphitheater of the ravine amplified sounds, making it impossible to determine the direction or distance of enemy movements, adding to the psychological stress of defenders who never knew when or where the next attack might come. Food became an obsession for soldiers who had been without rations for days. Men scoured the forest floor for anything edible, consuming roots, berries, and even bark in desperate attempts to maintain their strength. The lack of proper nutrition weakened the soldiers physically while simultaneously affecting their mental state, as hunger-induced fatigue made it increasingly difficult to maintain alertness during long hours of guard duty. Some soldiers reported hallucinations brought on by hunger and exhaustion, seeing movement in the forest that wasn't there, or hearing voices of comrades who had been killed days earlier. The German forces surrounding the pocket employed increasingly sophisticated tactics as the siege progressed. Snipers positioned themselves in carefully concealed positions that commanded key areas within the American defensive perimeter, making any movement during daylight hours extremely dangerous. Machine gun teams coordinated their fire to create interlocking fields that made it virtually impossible for American soldiers to move between positions without exposing themselves to deadly crossfire. The Germans also used sound tactics, creating noise in one area to mask movement in another, keeping the American defenders constantly off balance and uncertain about the true direction of threats. Captain McMurtry's leadership proved crucial during the most difficult moments of the siege. When German attacks threatened to overrun specific sections of the defensive perimeter, he personally led counterattacks that restored American positions and maintained the integrity of the defense. His ability to remain calm under the most extreme pressure provided a stabilizing influence on soldiers who were experiencing the full horror of modern warfare for the first time. McMurtry's practical approach to problem-solving, developed during his civilian career in industry, proved invaluable in organizing the defense and making the most efficient use of limited resources. The nights were perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the siege, as darkness brought new dangers and uncertainties. German infiltration attempts increased under cover of darkness, forcing American sentries to remain alert for sounds that might indicate enemy movement through the undergrowth. The forest came alive with mysterious sounds that could be wind through the trees, small animals moving through the brush, or German soldiers preparing for attack. Sleep became impossible for most soldiers, who dozed fitfully in their foxholes while maintaining weapons ready for immediate use. The psychological toll of sleepless nights compounded the physical exhaustion caused by constant combat, creating a downward spiral that threatened to break the will of even the most determined soldiers. On the fifth day of the siege, October 6th, the situation within the pocket had become desperate beyond anything the soldiers had previously imagined. Of the original 550 men who had advanced into the Argonne Forest, more than half had been killed, wounded, or were missing. The survivors huddled in shell holes and improvised bunkers that offered minimal protection from German fire, their uniforms torn and filthy, their faces gaunt from hunger and marked by the 1,000-yard stare that characterized men who had seen too much death. Medical supplies had been exhausted days earlier, leaving wounded soldiers to endure their injuries with nothing more than makeshift bandages and the comfort provided by their comrades. Major Whittlesey moved among his men during the brief periods when German fire slackened, offering words of encouragement and checking on the condition of his soldiers. His own appearance reflected the toll that command responsibility had taken during the siege. His uniform was stained with mud and blood, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes still held the determination that had sustained his men through 5 days of hell. He carried himself with the same methodical precision that had characterized his leadership from the beginning, but those who knew him well could see the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The German commanders surrounding the pocket had grown increasingly frustrated with their inability to dislodge the stubborn American defenders. What had begun as a tactical opportunity to eliminate an isolated enemy force had evolved into a prolonged siege that was tying down German troops needed elsewhere along the front. The Americans' refusal to surrender, despite overwhelming odds, had transformed a routine military operation into a test of wills that neither side could afford to lose. German casualties had also mounted during repeated assault attempts, and the longer the siege continued, the more it became a symbol of American determination that could inspire other Allied forces. Private Krotoshinsky's knowledge of the forest had grown intimate during the siege, as he had volunteered for numerous reconnaissance missions that took him beyond the American defensive perimeter. His small stature and natural stealth allowed him to move through the undergrowth without detection, gathering intelligence on German positions and identifying potential escape routes. On the night of October 6th, he approached Major Whittlesey with a proposal that would either save the Lost Battalion or result in his own death. He believed he could slip through the German lines and make contact with American forces, guiding a relief column back to the pocket. Whittlesey considered Krotoshinsky's proposal carefully, weighing the slim chance of success against the certainty that his men could not survive much longer without relief. The major knew that conventional rescue attempts had failed, as evidenced by the absence of any American forces, despite 5 days of siege. A single soldier, moving alone through the forest, might succeed where larger forces had failed, but the mission would require Krotoshinsky to traverse miles of German-controlled territory with no support and no guarantee that he would find friendly forces even if he escaped the immediate area. The decision to authorize Krotoshinsky's mission represented one of the most difficult command decisions Whittlesey had faced during the siege. Sending a soldier on what amounted to a suicide mission violated every instinct he possessed as a leader who had sworn to protect his men. But the alternative was to watch his remaining soldiers die slowly from wounds, hunger, and exhaustion while German forces gradually wore down their resistance. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Without relief, the Lost Battalion would cease to exist within days, making any risk worthwhile if it offered even a remote chance of salvation. Krotoshinsky prepared for his mission with the methodical care of a soldier who understood that his life depended on attention to detail. He blackened his face and hands with mud to reduce visibility, removed all equipment that might create noise during movement, and studied the German positions one final time before beginning his journey. His route would take him through the densest part of the forest, where the undergrowth provided maximum concealment, but also created numerous opportunities for detection by German sentries. The young private understood that he would have only one chance to reach American lines, as any mistake would result in capture or death. The night of October 6th passed with agonizing slowness for the soldiers remaining in the pocket. Every sound from the forest could indicate Krotoshinsky's progress, his capture, or simply the normal nocturnal activities of a forest at war. German harassment continued throughout the night with sporadic machine gun bursts and sniper fire, designed to prevent the Americans from resting or reorganizing their defenses. The psychological warfare was as effective as direct assault, keeping the defenders in a constant state of tension that drained their remaining energy reserves. Dawn on October 7th brought no immediate indication of Krotoshinsky's fate or the success of his mission. The German attacks resumed with their usual intensity, suggesting that enemy forces had not been alerted to any approaching relief column. Whittlesey maintained his command presence despite growing doubts about whether his desperate gamble would succeed. The major continued to move among his men, checking defensive positions, and ensuring that the survivors remained ready to fight. But privately, he began to consider the possibility that the Lost Battalion's stand was approaching its end. The breakthrough came in the early afternoon of October 7th, when the sound of American voices calling through the forest announced the arrival of relief forces. Private Krotoshinsky had successfully navigated through miles of German-controlled territory, located elements of the 307th Infantry Regiment, and guided them back to the pocket through the same treacherous route he had used to escape. The relief column fought its way through German positions that had been weakened by days of focus on the siege, creating a corridor that allowed supplies and reinforcements to reach the beleaguered defenders. The reunion between the Lost Battalion and their rescuers was marked by scenes of joy and relief that contrasted sharply with the horror of the preceding 6 days. Soldiers who had given up hope of survival embraced their rescuers with tears streaming down their faces, while medics immediately began treating wounded men who had endured days without proper medical care. The arrival of food and water seemed almost miraculous to soldiers who had been subsisting on forest vegetation and muddy stream water. But the greatest relief came from the knowledge that their ordeal was finally over. The cost of the Lost Battalion stand became apparent as casualty reports were compiled in the hours following the relief. Of the original 550 men who had advanced into the Argonne Forest on October 2nd, only 194 were able to walk out of the ravine under their own power. 107 soldiers had been killed during the siege, their bodies scattered throughout the defensive positions where they had fallen. 63 men were listed as missing, their fate unknown but presumed dead or captured. Approximately 190 soldiers had been wounded, many seriously, requiring immediate evacuation to field hospitals for treatment that would determine whether they would survive their injuries. The statistical summary of casualties told only part of the story of what the Lost Battalion had endured during their 6-day siege. The psychological wounds inflicted by the experience would prove as lasting as the physical injuries, as soldiers struggled to process the trauma of watching comrades die while facing their own mortality in the most direct way possible. Many of the survivors would carry the memories of the siege for the rest of their lives, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks that would later be recognized as symptoms of what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Major Whittlesey's leadership during the siege earned him immediate recognition from military authorities who understood the significance of what had been accomplished in the Argonne Forest. His promotion to lieutenant colonel came with the Battlefield Commission, acknowledging his performance under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The Medal of Honor that followed represented the nation's highest recognition of his courage and leadership, but those who knew Whittlesey understood that the honor came with a burden that would prove difficult to bear. Captain McMurtry and Captain Holderman also received the Medal of Honor for their actions during the siege, recognition that acknowledged their crucial roles in maintaining the defense and caring for their men under impossible conditions. The three officers had demonstrated different aspects of leadership under extreme stress, but their combined efforts had made the difference between survival and annihilation for the soldiers under their command. Their example would be studied by military leaders for generations as a case study in small unit leadership and the importance of maintaining morale under the most adverse circumstances. The story of the Lost Battalion quickly captured the imagination of the American public, providing a symbol of determination and courage that embodied the nation's commitment to the war effort. Newspaper accounts of the siege emphasized the heroic aspects of the stand, while downplaying the tactical errors that had led to the encirclement in the first place. The narrative that emerged focused on American soldiers refusing to surrender, despite overwhelming odds, a story that resonated with a public that needed heroes to justify the enormous cost of the war. The broader strategic impact of the Lost Battalion's stand extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Argonne Forest. The 6-day siege had tied down significant German forces at a critical moment in the war, preventing their deployment to other sectors where they might have slowed the Allied advance. The psychological effect on German morale was equally significant, as the Americans' refusal to surrender, despite hopeless circumstances, demonstrated a level of determination that suggested the war's outcome was inevitable. The German forces that had surrounded the pocket were forced to withdraw as Allied pressure increased along the entire front, abandoning positions they had held for years in the face of the renewed American offensive. The Lost Battalion's stand had served as a distraction that allowed other Allied units to break through German defensive lines, contributing to the collapse of resistance that would lead to the armistice just 5 weeks later. The tactical failure that had created the encirclement had been transformed into a strategic success through the courage and determination of soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The medical treatment of the Lost Battalion survivors revealed the full extent of the physical toll exacted by the siege. Malnutrition had weakened all of the soldiers, making them susceptible to diseases that would normally pose little threat to healthy young men. Wounds that had been treated with improvised medical supplies showed signs of infection that required immediate attention to prevent permanent disability or death. The psychological state of many survivors indicated trauma that would require long-term treatment. Though the medical understanding of combat stress was limited in 1918, Private Krotoshinsky's heroic mission through German lines earned him recognition as one of the war's most remarkable individual achievements. His successful navigation through miles of enemy-controlled territory, followed by his ability to guide relief forces back to the pocket, had literally saved the lives of nearly 200 American soldiers. The young immigrant from New York's Lower East Side had demonstrated that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely sources, embodying the democratic ideals that America claimed to represent in the war. The aftermath of the siege brought unwanted fame to Major Whittlesey, who found himself thrust into a public role that conflicted with his private nature and methodical personality. Speaking engagements, interviews, and public appearances became a constant demand on his time, forcing him to relive the traumatic experiences of the siege repeatedly for audiences who wanted to hear about heroism, but could not understand the psychological cost of command under extreme circumstances. The burden of being celebrated as a hero while carrying the guilt of decisions that had resulted in the deaths of so many of his men, created an internal conflict that would prove impossible to resolve. The Lost Battalion's story became part of American military folklore, taught in military academies, and cited in training manuals as an example of leadership and determination under fire. The tactical lessons learned from the siege influenced military doctrine regarding small unit operations and the importance of maintaining communications during combat operations. The psychological aspects of the siege contributed to a growing understanding of combat stress and its effects on soldiers, though this knowledge would not be fully developed until after subsequent conflicts. The German perspective on the siege revealed their own frustration with the tactical situation that had developed in the Argonne Forest. German commanders had recognized the opportunity presented by the isolated American force, but had underestimated the determination of soldiers who refused to surrender despite hopeless circumstances. The prolonged siege had cost German forces casualties they could not afford, while tying down troops needed elsewhere, contributing to the overall collapse of German resistance along the Western Front. The international recognition of the Lost Battalion's stand extended beyond American borders, as Allied forces throughout the Western Front drew inspiration from the story of soldiers who had refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. The siege became a symbol of Allied determination and a demonstration that American forces possessed the fighting spirit necessary to bring the war to a successful conclusion. The psychological impact on both Allied and German forces contributed to the momentum that would carry the Allies to victory in the final weeks of the war. The personal cost of the siege for Major Whittlesey became apparent in the years following the war, as he struggled to adjust to civilian life while carrying the burden of command decisions that had resulted in the deaths of so many of his men. The constant public attention and demands for appearances prevented him from processing the trauma of his wartime experiences, creating a cycle of stress that would ultimately prove fatal. His service as an honorary pallbearer at the interment of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery in November 1921 represented his final public duty, a fitting tribute to his service, but also a reminder of the cost of war. The tragedy of Whittlesey's death by suicide on November 26, 1921, highlighted the hidden wounds carried by many veterans of the Great War. His disappearance from the steamship Toloa during a voyage to Cuba was ruled a deliberate act, the final casualty of a siege that had ended 3 years earlier. His former commander's description of the death as, in reality, a battle casualty, acknowledged the connection between his wartime service and his ultimate fate, recognizing that some wounds never heal and some battles continue long after the shooting stops. The legacy of the Lost Battalion extends far beyond the 6 days they spent surrounded in the Argonne Forest, representing the courage and determination that characterized American military service during World War I. Their refusal to surrender, despite impossible odds, demonstrated the fighting spirit that would define American forces in subsequent conflicts, establishing a tradition of perseverance under fire that continues to inspire military personnel today. The tactical lessons learned from their siege contributed to improvements in military communications, logistics, and small unit tactics that would prove valuable in future wars. The story of the Lost Battalion serves as a reminder that heroism often emerges from desperate circumstances, when ordinary soldiers are called upon to demonstrate extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The men who fought in the pocket of the Ravin de Charlevoix were not professional soldiers but citizen warriors who answered their nation's call and proved themselves worthy of the trust placed in them. Their sacrifice and determination helped secure the victory that ended the Great War and preserved the democratic ideals for which they had volunteered to fight. The human cost of their stand cannot be measured solely in casualty statistics, as the psychological wounds inflicted by the siege affected not only the survivors, but also their families and communities for generations to come. The Lost Battalion's story reminds us that the true cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, touching the lives of all those who serve and those who love them. Their courage in the face of impossible odds stands as a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and overcome even the most desperate circumstances, providing inspiration for future generations who may face their own moments of trial and testing.